Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. To begin with, when it comes to the whole idea of green economy and the green infrastructure, there's $100 billion commitment that the world has already pledged to combat climate change. How do we utilize this commitment and channel this money into green projects?
First of all, it's not the world, it's the rich countries that committed to mobilizing an extra $100 billion to support climate mitigation and climate resilience. The bad news is actually they have not delivered that money. Maybe the amount of money that has been mobilized right now is 10, 15 billion in terms of new money. What they have been able to deliver is mobilizing more money from the multilateral institutions. But we have to also keep it in perspective. The total amount of financing that we need for sustainable infrastructure is in the order of $4 to $5 trillion a year. So this 100 billion is a very small amount, and as I said, of the 100 billion, they are really only providing a very, very small upfront money in terms of concessional funding. So we have to find financing from other sources to be able to help meet these needs.
Right, so that conveniently leads me to my next question, which is how we can get multilateral development banks and developmental financial institutions like the New Development Bank, the AIIB, and the ADB to promote sustainable infrastructure development and really invest and work towards those.
Yes, so that's exactly right. So these institutions can they can basically do two things. They can help address many of the constraints that prevent the realization of projects, of sound projects. But on the other side, they can help mobilize affordable financing and long-term financing, not just from themselves, but from the private sector to help support sustainable infrastructure and transition to a green economy. To give you an example, at the moment, these institutions are lending about 70 billion a year, including the AIB and the New Development Bank. But if you were really to invest a little bit of money in them, you could increase that to about more than 200 billion a year, and in turn, that could help us mobilize maybe an additional trillion. So, a lot of the effort that I put in is how to harness these institutions, and it's very important for India because India is the country that needs this financing more than any others, and it's extremely important for India to exercise leadership on the discussions of the future of these institutions, including in the G20.
So finally, my last question: what financial product or and instruments do we need to enable to further finance long-term green infrastructure projects, especially in emerging markets and developing economies like India?
So, if you listen to the discussion today, it was very clear that there are two types of financing needs. In the early stage of a project, which we call the construction phase, risks are very high, and you need long-term finance, but primarily debt finance to come in and help finance that part of the project. Once a project is operational, then you can securitize the asset, you can issue bonds, you can put it to institutional investors. At the moment, we don't have financing on scale for either of these. So the National Investment Infrastructure Fund that we talked about today is one way to try and catalyze that and catalyze financing, particularly on the second phase. But we need to put in mechanisms that can help finance the scale of the investment that we need. The second is we need to tilt incentives towards green economy. There is now a lot of bonds that are coming up, like green bonds. There is green financing, green banks, which is good because they are being more made aware that there is a huge opportunity in terms of green finance. So the kinds of institutions, so what we want to do is three things. We want to make sure that all institutions shift towards greener financing and awareness, and that they don't invest in things that will run into problems a few years later. The second is we want to ensure that there's much more disclosure of climate risk and about bad investments. And the third thing is we want to incentivize new investments so that, through green project bonds and through new types of instruments that can help mobilize the positive side of the finance picture.
And finally, if you don't mind a follow up, how can how can all of this be used to incentivize and bring the private sector into green financing and green infrastructure?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. So the private sector is key. So private sector always operates on the basis of market incentives. They are not doing this out of good heart. So the way you incentivize the private sector is first you de-risk the investment. So you ensure that the risks to the private sector are not high. And what does that mean? In infrastructure, it means that they must be assured of sources of funding, not finance, but who will ultimately pay for the infrastructure. In India, because we are not such a rich country, user charges have their limitations. You can't put all the cost of tomorrow's infrastructure on the back of today's users. So you have to find mechanisms to deal with that funding, and it can be a balance of of user charges and other kinds of revenues. The second thing you need to be able to do is to be with the private sector in terms of guarantees, co-financing and the like, so they're willing to come in. And in return, you need to move through instruments like green procurement, like regulation that says, you just can't invest, if you can't invest in things that create a lot of pollution. And you need to give them financing support that can help in some sense, catalyze a much larger pool of private financing. But when we talk about the private sector, we should remember that there are many different parts of the private sector. There is a private sector that consists of developers, the people who actually do the investment. As I said, there are banks that provide the upfront financing. And third, there are long-term institutional investors that provide takeout financing. So getting all these elements together is complicated in advanced countries. Project finance models, takeout financing, structured financing. In a country like India, we have very good finance skills. But our challenge will be to put in place governance arrangements, because oftentimes in infrastructure we get an unfortunate combination of bad public governance and bad private sector governance. So fixing that is the key to not just green, but to quality, cost effective and sound infrastructure.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.